She barked at the wall nonstop. What the dog found inside terrified even the police. The hallway had long forgotten what footsteps felt like. Paint peeled from the walls in soft curls, and the wooden floor groaned like it was trying to whisper something buried beneath it. The air was stale, heavy with a silence so thick it seemed to press against the chest. No breeze, no light from outside, just the breath of dust and shadows clinging to the corners. And yet, through that choking stillness, came a sound no one could ignore, a German shepherd barking over and over, louder each time. Her voice cracked with urgency, not aggression, like she was begging someone to understand something that words could never explain. Officer Marla Reyes stepped into the house cautiously, her boots sinking slightly into the grime-stained carpet. Her flashlight beam swept across the empty space, catching nothing but broken picture frames and the skeleton of a toppled chair. The dog, Raven, stayed fixed to a crumbling patch of drywall, her paws braced, her body trembling with something. More than fear. She barked again, shorter this time, and then let out a low, guttural whine as if pleading with the wall itself. It was the kind of sound that made your bones ache, as if grief had a voice and had chosen this moment to speak. Marla moved closer, unsure if she was about to uncover evidence or tragedy, or both. She crouched beside Raven and pressed her palm to the wall. It was colder than it should have been, like the chill of something that had been hiding far too long. There were faint claw marks near the baseboard, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for pain in the places no one cared to check. Marla felt her throat tighten, and a sudden sting rushed behind her eyes, though she could not say why. Raven backed up slightly but never turned away, her eyes fixed on that wall like it held the last truth in a world full of lies. Then, without warning, the barking stopped, as if the silence itself had demanded obedience. What replaced it was worse than any sound, the soft, unmistakable rustling of movement from within the wall. Marla froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her radio but not pressing the button just yet. Raven's ears twitched and lowered, her body now still as stone, her breath shallow but fast. The plaster cracked, just a hairline fracture at first, then widened with a sickening sound like skin being torn from old wood. Marla leaned in, her flashlight catching something pale behind the crumbling layers. A small, dirt-covered hand pushed through, trembling, fingers twitching like they had not seen light in years. And then a whisper, weak, broken, and terrified. Please, do not let him find me again. Before we dive into today's emotional story, I would love to hear from you. From which part of the world are you watching this video? It is always amazing to witness our global community coming together. If you have not already, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell icon so that you never miss an update. Now, let us get right into the story. Marla Reyes did not breathe for several seconds after the child's voice broke through the cracked wall. The words were too soft, like a secret being exhaled from a wound that never healed. Raven remained completely still, her ears tilted back, her body shielding the fragile space from where the hand had emerged. Marla slowly extended her fingers, not touching, just offering presence, steady, human, and calm. The child's hand recoiled at first, but then paused mid-air as if weighing danger against desperation. From that single moment, Marla knew this was not just another rescue call. It was a return to something she had buried long ago. Long before the badge, the gun, or the polished boots, Marla Reyes had lived through silence, just like this one. Not in an abandoned house, but in the cold corners of her childhood bedroom, where whispers of fear slept under her pillow. Her father's rages had been storms, sudden, violent, and always followed by shameful stillness. The dog she once loved A limping mutt named Bear used to sleep against her door like a barricade no one could cross. That dog had taken beatings for her more times than she could count, always returning, always loyal, until one night he did not come back. Even now, decades later, she remembered the emptiness of that door. Raven had the same eyes Bear had, wide, gold-ringed, and filled with ancient patience. When she first met Raven at the shelter 2 years ago, the dog had been on the kill list, labeled aggressive and unpredictable. But when Marla knelt down and looked into her face, Raven had lowered her head and touched her muzzle to the ground without a sound. The shelter staff had gasped, unsure of what had just passed between them. Marla did not explain. Some things did not require words to be understood. She took her home that same evening, knowing full well that this was not just adoption. It was redemption. Their bond had grown like roots under pressure, silent, deep, and unshakable. Raven did not bark at strangers, did not play fetch, did not wag her tail at sunshine. But she listened with the kind of attention that made you feel visible, even on days when you wanted to disappear. She followed Marla's every movement, mirrored her moods, and once, during a night patrol, had pulled her back just seconds before a floor collapsed under her boots. Every officer praised the dog's instincts, but Marla had always believed it was something else. Not instinct, memory perhaps, or a wound that recognized another wound in the dark. Now, in this broken house, that same bond had led them to the voice behind the wall. Marla could feel her own pulse in her throat as she called in backup with a quiet code. Her voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. It trembled because she already knew this child's silence. She knelt down, again, her knees pressing into crumbled plaster and shards of wood. Her flashlight cast shadows that danced like ghosts along the torn wallpaper. The child had not spoken again, but the fingers were still visible, shaking in the air like reeds against wind. "Raven will not let anyone hurt you," Marla said softly, her voice losing its command tone and falling into something more maternal. She did not say it for comfort, but because it was a fact carved from the truth of experience. Raven inched closer to the wall, then sat down, her body relaxed but alert, her gaze fixed on the smallest movement. Outside, sirens began to echo, faintly in the distance, a low promise that help was on its way. But Marla knew this rescue would not end with flashing lights and protocol. Some rescues required something more difficult, the kind of rescue that demanded memory, trust, and the patience to listen without trying to fix what could never be unbroken. As she waited for backup, her mind wandered briefly to her first year on the force. There had been a case, a boy locked in a basement for over a year, and she had frozen on scene, unable to speak, unable to move. It had been Raven's bark that snapped her back then, just as it had today. But what haunted Marla most was the look in that boy's eyes. Not fear, not relief, but a deep confusion about whether this was real. She saw that same look now forming in the child's half-hidden face. That unspoken question. Are you here? To save me? Or am I still dreaming? A loud crack came from somewhere deeper inside the house, not from the wall but beyond it. Raven sprang to her feet, teeth bared, head turning sharply toward the hallway behind them. Marla grabbed her flashlight tighter, scanning the shadows with slow precision, knowing that noise like that did not belong to an empty house. The child's hand vanished instantly, swallowed by the wall as if it had never been there. Marla wanted to call out, to beg the child not to disappear, but she dared not make noise now. Raven took 3 slow steps backward, never turning her back on the hallway. And that was when Marla saw it. A figure, just barely visible at the end of the corridor, standing completely still, watching them both. The figure at the end of the hallway did not move, but Marla could feel the weight of his stare like a blade pressed to her back. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as her free hand slowly lowered toward her holster, every nerve in her body tightening with silent warning. Raven let out a low, rumbling growl, so quiet it trembled more through the air than the ears. The hallway beyond the man fell into shadows too deep to see through, yet the figure stood out, not because of movement, but because of the absolute stillness that surrounded him. It was not natural. It was not right. He was too still, too calm, as if he belonged to the house in the same way rot belongs to wood. Marla did not speak, nor did she call out a warning, because some presences did not answer to language. Instead, she tapped twice against Raven's side, the signal they had practiced for years. Protection mode, hold the line, do not break. The dog responded instantly, stepping just ahead of her again, her body rigid and angled diagonally to block both the wall and the hallway. The figure remained frozen, and Marla's thoughts turned rapidly toward the child. The hand was gone, the whisper silenced, but the wall still breathed with something unseen. She had no idea how deep the hollow space ran or whether the child had a way out. Backup was too far. 3 minutes out if the dispatcher had moved fast, which meant a lifetime in this moment. The figure finally took a single step forward, and though it was slow, it carried the weight of violence, the kind that walks not to threaten but to claim. Marla raised her voice, sharp and clear, with all the force her training had ever given her. "Stop where you are!" she barked, her voice bouncing hard against the cracked ceiling. The man's head tilted slightly, not in surprise, but as if acknowledging a sound he had already expected. Raven snapped her teeth once, loud and deliberate, her bark a punctuation of warning no soul could misread. The figure paused, 1 foot forward, the other planted behind as if choosing which reality to obey. Then, without sound, he stepped backward, not retreating but folding back into the darkness like a curtain closing over an unfinished act. The hallway returned to stillness, but it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that follows a lie. Marla did not move for 3 full breaths, counting the seconds between her heartbeat and the sound of her own breath. Raven did not blink. Her body wound so tight Marla feared her muscles might tear from the strain. Then came the voice again, the child's voice, but it was not coming from the wall anymore. It was above them, faint, hoarse, barely clinging to sound, like a candle flickering at the end of its wax. "He is coming back," the voice said, so quietly that Marla questioned whether she had imagined it. "Please. Not again." The ceiling above creaked as if confirming the message, a slow, aching groan that carried dust down in soft curtains. Raven turned sharply, her nose pointed not to the ceiling, but to the far corner of the room where a vent lay half buried in plaster and rot. Marla moved quickly, dropping to her knees and tearing at the rusted screws with her utility knife. Her hands bled almost immediately, but she did not stop, did not wince, did not even speak. Raven hovered beside her, ears twitching toward the ceiling, then toward the hallway, then back to the wall. Too many directions, too much danger. The vent finally came loose with a scream of tearing metal, revealing a narrow crawl space that disappeared into darkness. Cold air rushed out, laced with rot, mildew, and something else Marla could not name, but knew she had smelled before. Fear that had sat too long in a place where no hope lived. She called softly into the hole. "I am here. You are safe now. Come toward my voice." Nothing came back, not even a breath, and she feared the child had either gone too far or had never moved at all. Raven lowered herself to the floor and crawled halfway into the vent, then barked once. A soft, rhythmic bark, the signal for presence. Someone was in there and they were still alive. Marla reached forward and turned on the flashlight mounted to Raven's collar, then whispered, "Find her, girl. Bring her home." Raven disappeared into the darkness, her body just narrow enough to fit through the crawl space. Marla pressed her face near the opening, listening to the soft scrapes of claws against ductwork. the occasional bark echoing deeper into the house's hollow skeleton. Then she heard it. Movement from above. Not soft this time, but fast and uneven, like boots dragging across unfinished wood. Marla rose, flashlight up, gun drawn now, her breath sharp and loud against the silence. Whoever had been watching them had changed his mind. He was not retreating. He was repositioning. Marla rushed to the narrow staircase at the back of the room, the steps nearly falling apart under her weight as she climbed. The second floor was darker, hotter, the air thick with the kind of heat that had no source. As she cleared the hallway, she heard the sound of something slamming. A vent cover, a door, or maybe a trap being closed. She scanned every corner, flashlight shaking slightly from the adrenaline tightening her fingers. But the floor was empty. No figure, no voice, no child, just the memory of movement and the echo of footsteps retreating into invisibility. Downstairs, Raven barked again. 3 short barks, then 1 long, her voice echoing through the crawl space like a signal flare. Marla flew down the steps, her boots nearly slipping as she landed and crawled to the vent again. Raven was backing out slowly, her teeth gently gripping a small, trembling arm, careful not to injure, guiding rather than dragging. Behind her came a girl no older than 6, covered in dust and dried blood, her hair matted, her eyes swollen, and rimmed in red. Marla pulled her forward, wrapping her arms around her body as the child collapsed silently into her chest. No words, no sobs, just a raw, broken stillness that said everything words never could. The girl's hand gripped Marla's vest, and for the first time her voice returned, barely more than a breath. He said if I screamed again, he would come back with the other ones. Marla held her tighter, her own tears now falling silently into the child's tangled hair. But she knew this was not over. Somewhere in this house, or beyond it, someone was waiting. Someone who did not expect to be interrupted, someone who had not yet shown his face. And in that moment, as sirens finally lit the windows in red and blue, Marla knew this was not the end of a case. It was the beginning of something deeper, darker, and far from finished. Raven did not leave the girl's side, even when the paramedics arrived with blankets and soft voices. The officers tried to separate them gently, but the moment a stranger came close, Raven growled low, her body shielding the girl like armor made of fur and loyalty. Marla stepped in quickly, her voice calm but firm, placing a steady hand on Raven's back. She stays, she said, and though protocol begged to differ, no one argued. The child's grip did not loosen from Raven's neck, her small face pressed tightly into the dog's coat. For the first time in hours, her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of Raven's steady heartbeat. Marla watched the girl being lifted into the ambulance, Raven jumping up beside her without hesitation. There were no words exchanged between them, just a silent agreement born of trauma that neither had asked for. As the doors closed and the ambulance pulled away, Marla stood in the driveway of the decaying house, the structure now crawling, with police, forensics, and taped barriers. And yet, it was not over. Not for her, and not for Raven. This house had awakened something ancient in the dog, a tremble Marla had not seen since the day she first brought her home. She could feel it. Whatever had happened here was far from over. Back at the precinct, Marla sat in the K9 unit's records room, fingers scrolling through old files trying to find something, anything, that could explain Raven's behavior. She had always been loyal, always brave, but something about the crawl space, the wall, and the child had stirred an old pain that Raven could not hide. Marla remembered the dreams Raven used to have in the early months. Violent, shaking, muffled whines that seemed to claw their way out of her chest. The shelter had told her very little, only that Raven was picked up near a burned-out farmhouse, on the edge of a forgotten county line. The officers who found her noted the blood on her muzzle, though none of it was hers, and the fact that she refused to leave the collapsed cellar beneath the house. That cellar had never been searched. The property had been condemned and buried under a demolition order. Marla drove there that night. The address still burned into the corner of the shelter records. The land was now overtaken by weeds and rusted fence posts, but the foundation still showed through in cracked concrete and blackened stones. Raven sniffed the air as soon as the door opened, and by the time they arrived at the ruins, her body was already shaking, not in fear, but recognition. Marla followed her through thorns and twisted branches until they reached the edge of the basement. Entrance, now collapsed but partially accessible through a narrow gap. Raven whined and sat beside it, her body rigid, her eyes refusing to blink. Marla shone her flashlight into the dark, and there, beneath the rubble, glinted something metallic. She pulled at it, hands dirty, knees pressed to the ground as memories flashed in pieces she did not yet understand. The object was a collar, half buried, covered in soot, with a tag that had nearly rusted into nothing. But the name was still visible, just barely. Scout. Marla looked at Raven, who did not react to the name, but something in her eyes flickered, as if some part of her had once known the sound. She checked the tag's number and traced it through old animal control records once she returned to her vehicle. What she discovered made her chest tighten. Scout had been a trained service dog, assigned to a girl named Leah Denton, reported missing after a house fire 10 years ago. Neither Leah nor her father had ever been found. Marla sat still, the pieces falling like ash into a puzzle no one had dared to assemble. She dug further into the case, pulling forgotten police reports, archived interviews, and photos hidden in paper files no one had digitized. Leah's father had been under investigation for illegal confinement and suspected trafficking, though no charges were ever filed. Neighbors had reported screaming, children's laughter that did not belong to the neighborhood, and a girl who vanished from her school records 2 months before the fire. Raven, or Scout, had been there. She had seen it all. And when the fire came, she had survived. But no one ever connected her back to the story. It explained her nightmares, her violent reaction to confinement, and her hyper-attachment to children in distress. It explained the bark that had sounded so desperate inside the crawl space. It had not been a reaction to the child. It had been memory guiding her back to a place where she had once failed. Marla pressed her palm to her own chest, trying to control the shaking that had begun deep within her ribs. Raven had saved that child not just because of instinct, but because she had been too late once before. This time, she had chosen to rewrite the ending. Marla's hands trembled as she printed the last document. A photo of Leah Denton and her dog, Scout, taken at a school fundraiser just months before they both vanished. The dog in the picture was younger, less scarred, but unmistakably Raven. Marla stared at it for a long time, as if waiting for Raven herself to look and remember. But the dog only sat quietly beside her, eyes closed, as if guarding something invisible. A knock on the precinct door pulled Marla back into the moment. It was one of the detectives from the scene, his face pale, his hands unsteady as he held out a small, blood-stained drawing wrapped in an evidence bag. "This was, found inside the wall," he said. "It matches the girl's handwriting." Marla took it gently, unsealing the bag to reveal a piece of paper torn from a notebook. On it was a rough drawing of a dog with glowing eyes, standing in front of a doorway. Above the drawing, the words were written in uneven lines. "The last time she came, he disappeared." Below it, just one sentence. "She only barks when someone evil is still inside." Marla's breath hitched, her eyes moving to Raven, who now sat alert, her head turned slightly toward the precinct hallway. A soft sound echoed from beyond the door. Not loud, not deliberate, just the faint clicking of boots against tile. No one was scheduled to enter the precinct at this hour. Marla rose slowly, hand on her sidearm, her body shielding Raven by instinct. The hallway light flickered once, and then again, as Raven's ears lowered, her breath deepening into that same trembling growl she had made in the house. This story was not finished, not by a long breath. Raven's past had returned, not just as memory, but as a warning. And the man who thought he had escaped 10 years ago had just stepped back into a world that no longer allowed silence to protect him. Somewhere in this building, behind a badge or a fake name, someone was still hiding. And this time, the dog who had once failed to save her girl was ready to bare teeth for the next one. Marla turned to Raven, then toward the hallway and whispered without fear, "Find him." Marla stepped into the hallway with her hand on the holster and her breath steady. But the air felt heavier than it should have been, each fluorescent. Light flickered above her like a ticking clock counting down toward something inevitable. Raven moved beside her with perfect silence, her muscles tense, her eyes scanning every corner as if reading a language only she could see. The hallway, once familiar and mundane, now pulsed with invisible warning signs, creaks in the floor, shifting air pressure, a shadow that did not belong. They passed the evidence room, its door slightly ajar, though it had been locked tight, when Marla left earlier. Raven paused there, nose twitching, tail rigid, then moved on without sound. The scent trail led deeper into the precinct, down into the lower records level where few officers ever ventured. Marla keyed open the rusted access door, its lock reluctantly clicking open with a mechanical groan that echoed like a siren. Dust swirled in the narrow stairwell, catching the light of her flashlight in drifting sheets that obscured more than they revealed. She descended slowly, her boots planting with calculated care, while Raven moved just ahead, her growl returning, low, steady, barely vibrating through the air. Marla knew that sound now better than any siren or alarm. It was the sound Raven made when she had caught the scent of someone who should not exist. When they reached the landing, the basement door was already open. Inside, the records room was dark save for the dim glow of a single desk lamp left on at the far end. Folders lay open, photographs strewn across the floor, many of them decades old, some marked with missing persons stamps, others with redacted names and sealed signatures. But it was the wall that stopped Marla, a section of drywall removed, revealing an exposed panel of steel-backed concrete with dozens of pinned case files taped across it. Her eyes scanned the images, her breath catching as she saw Leah Denton's name listed 3 times, each under different aliases. Others followed. Children who had vanished from foster systems, girls whose cases were quietly closed after. Police investigation. The name at the bottom corner chilled her. Officer Samuel Krenner, missing in action, presumed dead, 10 years ago. The door behind her clicked, not slammed, not shoved, just quietly clicked, the unmistakable sound of a lock turning from the outside. Marla spun around, flashlight up, gun raised, but saw nothing but darkness beyond the glass. Raven lunged at the door with a snarl, her body crashing into the frame just seconds after the bolt slid into place. The stairwell light above flickered, out plunging them into partial shadow. Marla tapped her radio, but it only crackled, jamming with a static that sounded eerily like breath. They were not just trapped. They were being watched, tested, and whoever had led them here had done so knowing exactly who Raven was. In the silence, a small speaker mounted on the far wall clicked to life. A voice emerged, low, familiar, but digitally altered, a whisper covered in static. She failed before, but she will not this time. That is what you believe, is it not, Officer Reyes? Marla did not respond, but Raven barked sharply, a single warning shot of sound that cut through the shadows like a blade. The voice continued, slower now, laced with mockery. But you still do not understand. This place remembers. The dog remembers. But memory alone is not truth. Marla stepped forward, her weapon steady, though her hand trembled beneath the surface of discipline. She had heard this voice before, years ago, during a botched internal inquiry involving missing evidence in child exploitation cases. Back then, the case had vanished without explanation, and the detective assigned to it had taken early retirement before disappearing entirely. It had been filed under procedural mismanagement. But now she saw the truth staring back at her, from the wall of redacted lives. The corruption was not old. It was current, alive, and feeding on silence. And someone inside the department had made sure it would never reach the surface. Raven moved toward the steel wall, sniffing near a panel that looked newer than the rest, her nose twitching with urgency. Marla tapped it gently. Hollow. Behind it was a crawl space or chamber, another hidden corridor beneath the station. The dog's body stiffened, her tail slowly lowering as her ears twitched toward the vent overhead. Footsteps, soft, dragging, like someone walking barefoot over tile, echoed above. Marla raised her flashlight just as a shape moved past the upper grate, tall, hooded, carrying something slung over one shoulder. Then it was gone. Marla turned back to the steel panel and tore it open with the butt of her weapon. Behind it, a narrow shaft led down into deeper darkness, concrete, sharp angles, and the scent of mold and something worse. Raven moved first, her body slipping into the space with calm precision. Marla followed, sliding through jagged edges and descending into what felt less like a basement and more like a burial chamber. The temperature dropped, and her breath began to fog, the space around her feeling tight, closed, and unfinished. They emerged into a long corridor beneath the station, lined with old furniture, boxed files, and security footage monitors that still blinked, still recording. On one of the monitors, Marla saw herself, standing inside the precinct with Raven beside her. A live feed. Someone was still watching. On another screen, she saw a hallway lined with cells that no longer existed on the building's blueprints. And in one of them, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was the girl from the wall. Not a replay, not a memory, but live footage. Raven barked twice, loud and sharp, her body pulling toward the hallway door. Marla slammed her fist on the panel, then moved toward the screen, searching for access. The child turned toward the camera, and for the first time, she spoke directly to it. "He said you would not come," she whispered. "But I knew you would. The other girl told me you would." Marla's blood turned to ice. The other girl, Leah. Somehow, some part of her had reached through memory, pain, or time to bring this moment forward. And now Marla had to choose whether to follow a truth the system never wanted her to find, or walk away and live with what would be lost forever. Marla stared at the flickering monitor, her breath caught halfway between horror and disbelief. The child on the screen looked up again, her eyes hollow yet unblinking as if she could feel Marla watching. Raven let out a long, mournful sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but something between a whimper and a war cry. Marla reached forward and placed her hand on the glass, as if touch alone could close the distance. Her fingers trembled, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the fear she had spent years burying under uniforms and procedure. She whispered the words aloud, not to herself, but to Raven, to the girl, and to the silence that surrounded them. "We are going to bring her out." The corridor ahead was lit only by emergency strips, casting a blood-red glow on the concrete walls that bled like open wounds. Marla moved quickly now, each step heavy with memory and resolve, her flashlight cutting swaths of clarity through decades of darkness. Raven surged forward, no longer sniffing, no longer hesitating. She had become a spear, a blade, a storm held together by fur and fury. The hallway bent sharply, and they came upon the first door, thick steel, no handle, no keypad, only a fingerprint scanner glowing faintly beside a battered clipboard nailed into the wall. Marla pressed her thumb to the panel without hope, but it blinked green and clicked open like it had been waiting for her all along. Behind the door was a narrow passage, and at its end, a cage. The girl sat in the center of it, her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, her face blank with the kind of numbness that takes years to forget. When she saw Raven, something in her posture changed. Not relief, not fear, but a stillness that was almost sacred. Raven sat outside the cage, her eyes locked on the child, her body rigid, her tail unmoving, as if she knew they had arrived at the moment where everything must break or be rebuilt. Marla stepped forward, her voice soft, steady, breaking the air like a gentle hand on glass. "You are safe now. No one will hurt you again. We are here." But the girl shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving Raven's. "He said the dog would come. He said she would find me just like she did before." Marla felt her throat tighten as the child whispered one more phrase that dropped like a stone into her chest. "But he also said, if she gets this far, he will take her back." And then came the noise, a metallic slam from behind them, followed by a cold gust of air and the sickening sound of boots scraping against steel grates. Marla turned sharply, weapon raised, her breath catching as she saw the silhouette emerge from the far corner. The man was tall, cloaked, and carried something under his arm. Not a weapon, but a remote device, blinking red like the heartbeat of a ticking bomb. Raven lunged first, teeth bared, but the man raised the device and pressed something, and she stopped midair. Her body convulsed once, then twice, her legs trembling, her head low, but her eyes still on the child. The man laughed, a sound that cut through the chamber like broken glass. "She was mine long before you put a leash on her." Marla screamed Raven's name, rushing forward, firing her weapon. The bullet tore through his shoulder, but he did not fall. He dropped the device and it shattered against the floor, sending a spray of sparks across the concrete. Raven collapsed, panting, shaking, her muscles frozen in place as if her very soul had been caught in a trap. The man lunged toward the child, but Marla intercepted him, tackling him into the wall with the weight of every loss she had ever swallowed. They struggled, hands, knees, blood, breath, until Marla finally slammed his head into the concrete with a cry that did not come from her throat, but from the memory of every girl he had buried beneath silence. The child screamed then, not in fear, but in warning, and Marla turned just in time to see a second figure appear behind her, smaller, faster, a shadow that had been waiting for the perfect moment. It raced toward Raven with something sharp glinting in its hand, but the dog moved before Marla could even shout. Raven surged up, teeth finding flesh, dragging the figure down with a primal snarl that shook the room. She did not stop. Not until the weapon clattered to the floor, not until the screams turned into silence, not until the child called her name. And when she stopped, she did not look proud. She looked tired, like something ancient had finally been released from inside her chest. Marla pulled the child into her arms as Raven limped back toward them, blood dripping from her mouth, her eyes dim but focused. The girl held on to both of them, her hands gripping Marla's shoulder and Raven's ear as if afraid that either one might vanish again. Behind them, the corridor filled with the sound of footsteps. This time real ones. Backup officers with flashlights and orders. Marla stood slowly, her voice steady now, her words clear. "We have survivors. The others are down. Secure the room, seal the exits. No one leaves until I say so." Raven collapsed beside the girl, her body shaking, her eyes closing slowly, as if finally allowed to rest. Marla knelt beside her, placing both hands on the dog's chest, whispering quietly. "You found her. You remembered. And this time you did not let him take her. The child watched them both, tears streaking down her face, not from fear, but from something harder to name: release. She leaned into Raven and pressed her forehead against the dog's neck, whispering something too soft for anyone to hear. But Raven's tail thumped once against the ground. In the hours that followed, the building was sealed, reports were written, names were confirmed. The corruption went deeper than anyone had dared imagine. Records falsified, victims hidden, lives erased behind polished glass and hollow metals. Marla gave her statement, but left out what only she and Raven could ever explain: the voice of a past that never died, and a bond forged not in training, but in trauma. The child was taken to safety, not into a system, but into care, into light. And Raven, though scarred, would heal beside her. But just before they left, the girl turned to Marla with one last question. How did she know I was there? How did she remember me if she had never seen me before? Marla knelt down, brushed the girl's hair back, and answered truthfully. Because someone she loved once waited in the dark just like you. And no one came in time. That pain never left her. It became her compass, and it brought her to you. The precinct was never the same after that night, though most would never speak of it again. The lights were fixed, the walls repainted, and the case files quietly archived beneath layers of bureaucracy and caution tape. But some things cannot be painted over, and some sounds, like the quiet bark of a dog refusing to leave, never truly fade. Raven recovered slowly, her steps uneven at first, her breath heavier, but her eyes still burned with that ancient unknowing. She returned not to duty, but to something far more sacred: the quiet space beside the child's bed, where she would sleep without command, without expectation. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, had rewritten her ending. Marla visited them every Sunday, never in uniform, never with questions. She brought books, soft toys, and sometimes just silence, the kind that heals without needing to explain where the pain once lived. The child, now named Clara, spoke little, but she no longer shook in her sleep or flinched when someone called her name. She drew pictures often, always of a dog standing between two shadows, always with bright eyes and fur that seemed made of fire and ash. When asked what it meant, she would only whisper, "She stands where others run." Marla understood that better than any psychiatrist ever could. One evening, Clara pointed to a drawing of a door, tall, cracked, with a hand reaching through the center, and asked, "How many others are still behind their walls?" The question hung in the air like smoke, not meant to be answered, only honored. Marla sat down beside her, took her hand, and said, "Enough to make sure we never stop knocking." That night, she filed for permanent reassignment, not to another unit, not to promotion, but to outreach. Her badge would not protect her from the system's darkness, but her presence, her listening, her refusal to forget, would be the first light many had ever seen. Raven watched her from the doorway, tail gently tapping the floor, eyes soft but alert. She had seen the worst of man and had still chosen to return, not because she believed in humans, but because she believed in healing. Each child she met afterward seemed to recognize her before they even spoke. They did not need to be told her story. They felt it in her stillness, in the way she waited without judgment, without flinching. She became more than a dog in recovery. She became a mirror for the broken, and a reminder that even the forgotten can rise again. The city still sleeps with its secrets, its shadows tucked behind walls that whisper but never scream. There are still names not written, voices not heard, and eyes watching from behind polished doors. But somewhere in that silence, a dog waits patiently beside a bed, and a woman wakes every morning with the memory of a hand pushing through drywall and a whisper that changed everything. Their story is not one of heroes or endings, but of beginnings no one believed in. And if you ever hear barking where there should only be silence, stop, listen, and remember. Sometimes the ones making noise are not angry. They are trying to show you where the forgotten are still waiting.